Do you think your job is incredibly hard and unbearable these days? Then it might be worth taking a look at some professions from history, because they may completely change your mind. Hundreds of years ago in England, some people earned their living by literally climbing into pits filled with human waste. These people were called Gong Farmers. Their job was to empty and clean cesspits located beneath houses and toilets, pits that were filled to the brim with human waste. This profession had existed for centuries, but it reached its peak between 1485 and 1603, during the Tudor period, at a time when modern toilets did not yet exist. People usually relieved themselves in public latrines, but there was a serious problem. By the late 14th century in England, there was only one public toilet for approximately 2,000 people. On top of that, all this waste accumulated in deep, stone-lined pits and piled up over time. In other words, people kept adding new waste on top of pits that were already overflowing. As this situation began to pose serious threats to public health, local authorities took action. Special toilet pits were allowed to be built near homes and residential areas. However, this did not solve the problem. The waste levels continued to rise, and eventually, someone was needed to empty these pits. This is exactly where Gong Farmers came in. The word gong was derived from an Old English term meaning to go. These workers were also known as nightmen because they were only allowed to work at night. At the time, there were no flashlights or proper lighting systems. Most of the time, the only source of light was the moon. Gong Farmers would climb into these pits and remove the waste using buckets and shovels. The waste was then poured into barrels and transported by carts to riverbanks, where it was later used as fertilizer. During this work, some had to stand knee-deep, some waist-deep, and some even neck-deep in the waste. Of course, this job carried serious risks. The greatest danger was toxic gases that accumulated in enclosed spaces. Because there was no ventilation, some workers would lose consciousness and drown inside the pits. Another risk was the collapse of pit walls that had not been properly maintained. Additionally, even the smallest wound could lead to severe infections. Despite all these dangers, the workers were paid well. Gong Farmers earned around 6 pence per day, which was considered a very high wage at the time. However, society shunned them. They were only allowed to live in certain areas of the city, and people avoided them whenever possible. Chimney sweeps. If you are looking for a job that is both physically exhausting and mentally devastating, one of the best historical examples is chimney sweeping. Especially during the Tudor period in England, urbanization increased rapidly, and nearly every home had a fireplace. Fireplaces were used for heating, cooking, and as a source of light. But as wood and coal burned, flammable soot accumulated inside the chimneys, creating a serious fire hazard. The government made it mandatory for chimneys to be cleaned at least 4 times a year. The problem was this: chimneys were not built for humans to enter. They were narrow, crooked, and extremely dangerous. The solution, unfortunately, was to use children. Children as young as 6, often taken from orphanages, were forced to climb into chimneys and clean them, usually naked. These children were known as climbing boys. Over time, exposure to soot and grime caused a deadly disease, especially in boys, known as chimney sweeps cancer. This illness often led to death within just a few years. Match girls. By the late 19th century, match production had become a major industry. In England alone, there were around 25 match factories employing thousands of workers. The main substance used in match production was white phosphorus. It was highly flammable, toxic, and extremely dangerous. Most of the workers in these factories were young women. They spent their days packaging millions of matches and inhaling phosphorus fumes. Long-term exposure caused a disease known as phossy jaw. It began with toothaches, followed by tooth loss, and eventually the jawbone would rot. A significant number of those affected lost their lives. In 1888, approximately 1,400 women went on strike to demand better working conditions. The strike was successful. In 1908, England completely banned the use of white phosphorus. Ship pullers, burlaks, In Russia, particularly along the Volga River, workers known as burlaks pulled ships upstream using ropes. Because the wind often blew in the opposite direction, ships could not move on their own. As a result, dozens, sometimes hundreds of people were required to pull a single ship. This work was usually done by poor peasants. During winter, rivers froze, making work impossible and survival even more difficult. In the early 19th century, it is estimated that there were around 600,000 burlaks. However, with the rise of steam-powered ships, this profession eventually disappeared. Snake milkers. Throughout history, snake venom was often used to coat arrowheads, especially in warfare. Collecting this venom was the job of snake milkers. These individuals captured snakes and extracted venom from their glands. A single bite often meant death. Today, snake milking still exists, but its purpose is no longer war. It is now done to produce anti-venom. Drummer boys. Before modern communication tools existed, armies relied on drummers to communicate on the battlefield. Drummers signaled attacks, retreats, and formation changes using drums. Most drummers were children. While playing drums, they also carried the wounded, assisted doctors, and buried the dead. They were usually not allowed to carry weapons and were completely defenseless on the battlefield. The king's toilet attendant, groom of the stool. One of the most unusual positions in England was the groom of the stool. This person was present during the king's most private moments. Their duties included preparing the king's toilet, observing whether his health was good or poor, and cleaning. They also kept records of the king's health and reported them to royal physicians. Although the job may sound strange, it was actually a prestigious position. These individuals had direct access to the king and could wield significant political influence. This role existed from 1495 until 1901. If these professions interest you, there are many more difficult and unusual jobs throughout history. Subscribe so you don't miss them.